Okay, listen, it probably isn't that deep. The proverbially blue curtains probably are just blue curtains.
Well, if we weren't getting letters before, we're gonna be getting them now.
No, here's the thing. All the time, I run into readers and writers who get all twisted up in knots and have a hard time making any progress because they get stuck on uncovering the deep mysteries of the blue curtains. What do they mean? I can't keep reading if I don't know. How do I imbue them with deep psychological significance? I can't keep writing if I don't figure out a way to do that. Friends, the curtains are blue. Let's move on. Just say they're beige if you're having a really hard time, and let's get on to more important things.
Okay, if you really want this comment section, I can't stop you. But I can sit back and enjoy the devastation.
I mean, I know that there are a lot of people out there who think that you aren't really reading unless you're simultaneously composing a master's thesis, and that you aren't really writing unless you're crafting the next great puzzle for PhD candidates for generations to come. But I just want to let you know that you don't have to do that. It's just not that deep. I've got a lot to say, so let's warm up with an example. When I was in high school, I had to read Ernest Hemingway's The Old Man and the Sea. Like any book anyone reads in high school, I barely remember it, but I did come across a well-known statement made by Hemingway in one of his letters the other day. Then there is the other secret. There isn't any symbolism. The sea is the sea. The old man is an old man. The boy is a boy and the fish is a fish. The shark are all sharks, no better and no worse. And he goes on to denounce the symbolism that people have found in it in some rather scatological terms. So it seems like a pretty straightforward and authoritative argument that blue curtains should not be analyzed as anything other than blue curtains. According to Hemingway, any discussion of the old man and the sea that goes beyond the story as a story about a man and the sea is a big pile of nonsense. It's just not that deep, and that's not me saying it. It's the author and winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature himself saying that. So case closed. Well, except that if you spend even 6 minutes on an academic database, you can find all kinds of articles written by scholars that make all kinds of claims about what the old man and the sea means. Just take a look at some of these titles. If Hemingway said the novel is just a story and that we should just read everything in that story as a literal part of a straightforward plot, why is anyone writing articles that propose feminist readings of a gendered ocean, reframings of the story as Nietzschean tragedy, Taoist interpretations of the symbols that aren't symbols, or eco-critical analyses of one man trying to catch one fish in one boat? Either we take the author at his word, and all those scholars are pretending to be intellectuals without having a leg to stand on, or we say that Hemingway didn't know what he was talking about at worst, or was playing coy at best, and it's a good thing we have some intelligent, functional adults in the room who know how to write about the feminine symbolism of the ocean in The Old Man and the Sea. Or, we could take a third path and recognize that writers, readers, and critics are all different groups of people with different priorities. Hemingway can be fully correct in saying that all he did was write a story about a man and the sea. And the scholars can be fully correct in saying that the book has something to say about cultural imperialism too. Or take another much less illustrious example. When I was in poetry school, I wrote a poem about cleaning a church building that was in a bad state of neglect, like think scooping up dead lizards levels of neglect. It was a memorable experience, and I liked the idea of writing a poem that focused on the strong contrasts between the filthiness of the church at the start and the pristine cleanliness at the end. My full purpose was to describe the experience and what it felt like to be involved in a project like that. Well, when I took that piece to our weekly workshop, one of my fellow poets gave a lovely speech about how my poem was a fascinating examination of the relationship between faith and work, a piece that was about the sanctifying power of labor. And what do you do at a time like that but nod? That all sounded pretty great. It sounded pretty smart. But I absolutely did not set out to write a theological treatise in verse on the nature of faith and work. I just wanted to describe a memorable experience. It wasn't that deep. But it's hard to say that my friend was wrong, and similar things happened week after week with all of our poems. I can't count the number of times that someone said something about someone's poem, only for the author to respond along the lines of, "Yeah, I totally meant to do that." In the writer's eyes, it was pretty much never as deep as the readers had made it out to be. And at the heart of all of this is a key difference in the way that writers and readers, especially critics, approach texts. So I want to do a little work today to explain both sides of this issue, because people who say it isn't that deep aren't illiterate slobs, and people who assert that it is that deep aren't pretentious snobs.
So, Bud, if you're trying to have it both ways, does that make you a slobby snob or a snobby slob?
Well, I guess that's up for you to decide. For now, let's start with the writerly approach to the text. Now, of course, I'm no Nobel laureate, but whenever I'm writing, my full and only purpose is to communicate my message as clearly and pleasantly as possible. I want people to know what I'm saying, and I want them to have a nice time too. At no point am I fretting over the deeper meaning of my work. Like Hemingway, when I write that I enjoy the meditative process of cooking, I really do mean that I like the meditative process of cooking. Cooking is not a cover story for unrequited love or the geopolitics of food production or something else. It isn't that deep. It's just about cooking. So please, don't try to turn it into something that it's not. And Hemingway and I aren't alone in that. I've spent pretty much my entire adult life reading books about the craft and theory of writing. And do you know how many of them have had chapters about encoding deep secret meanings into your work? Exactly 0. On the other hand, do you know how many of them were focused on communicating ideas straightforwardly and evoking emotions clearly? Every single one of them. I mean, take it from a poet. Poetry is never encoded. It is never a covert operation whose information is ciphered and must be deciphered. From an essayist, an essay needs a lighted sign right up front telling the reader where they are going. Otherwise, the reader will be distracted and nervous at each stop along the way, unsure of the destination, not at all able to enjoy the ride. Or a fiction writer. You can't write down your intellectual understanding of a hero or villain and expect us to be engaged. Or take Joseph Williams' famous textbook, Style, Lessons in Clarity and Grace, and notice that it's not lessons in obscurity and secrets. Say the thing. Say it straightforwardly and clearly, and say it with some literary elegance. The old man is an old man, the sea is the sea, and the fish is a fish. There's no deep meaning beyond the pleasures of a good story. Wow, you must really be dense to think that writers don't create deep meaning in their work. I can think of at least 3 authors that nobody has ever heard of that write really dense and obscure stuff. They're geniuses, and you're just showing what a shallow hack you are by saying otherwise. First of all, thanks for commenting and contributing to the video's engagement metrics. It really does mean a whole lot. Secondly, you're getting ahead of yourself. We're not talking about what you as a reader think of someone else's work yet. And thirdly, of course, writers don't always just say things in plain literal language, but that's not the same thing as encoding deep secrets into your work, which again, I've yet to hear a practicing writer endorse an approach to writing rooted in cryptography. So yeah, what do we do though with the more difficult pieces? Pieces that don't just seem to say what they mean straightforwardly. What about Emily Dickinson telling the truth, but telling it slant? Well, it's worth remembering that literary writers are not just in the business of transferring ideas from their head to yours. They want to create experiences, to evoke emotions and provoke reactions that go beyond, ah yes, I am able to comprehend the literal meaning of every word contained in this text. Message received. Why would a poet choose to put you in the woods, listening to the crunching snow and the spurs of the boots of someone they love, rather than just write straightforwardly that they love so-and-so? Well, because they don't just want to tell you that. They want you to experience it, to feel what it's like rather than just hear about it secondhand. Why would an essayist indulge in metonymy, hyperbole, anaphora, or litetes, or any of the ways of dressing up language, at the risk of making propositional meaning less clear? Because clarity is important, but so is the actual experience of reading the text. Again, turning to Williams, it's clarity and grace, not just clarity, that matters. Those priorities are often in tension, but one is not absolutely more important than the other. Some writers are more interested in showing what they can do with words than in reproducing scientific descriptions of what happened. The more I've learned about writing, the more I think I understand painters who paint things that don't look like anything, or chefs who prepare expensive dishes that are too small to fill you up. Because it's not about filling your belly, it's about arranging flavors in new and exciting ways, demonstrating creative and innovative culinary technique, and pushing the limits of what's possible with basic ingredients and a stove. In the same way, literary writing is not just about communicating basic semantic content. It's about stretching language, creating novel and exciting experiences, and showing what's possible in writing. It's okay for you to leave hungry as long as you also leave having had a memorable literary experience.
So writers never try to hide their meaning, but they also do things that hide their meaning. Wow, it's like watching a train derailment in slow motion.
No, bud. Writers aren't in the business of burying deep secrets in their work for readers to excavate. But because they prioritize clarity of experience and feeling in addition to clarity of meaning, sometimes they do things to amplify an emotional effect that may be at odds with semantic simplicity. You might end up with a clearer idea of how you feel after reading a piece than of what it was saying. And for some writers, that's a fair trade, but it's not the same thing as hunching over a desk and producing ciphers. For example, we once had a poet visit the same workshop class I mentioned earlier. We had read his book, and as student poets, we had puzzled over his sometimes wild and seemingly incomprehensible poems. There was strange, surreal imagery, unusual arrangement, poet stuff. When he came to class, we kept asking questions about what one thing really meant or how to interpret some other thing. And every time he just shrugged or said, "It doesn't really mean anything. I just thought it was an interesting image." Classic, the sea is just the sea kind of stuff. But he made a larger point that not only helps us to conclude our fun little chat about writers, but also sets up what we'll have to say about readers. And it was that there are two different tools that writers have access to that we sometimes mistakenly treat as the same thing. And the first is metaphor, which, as he explained, works like an equation. One thing is another. For metaphor to work, you need both halves of that equation clearly and explicitly in the work. A reader cannot understand that you mean to say that your aunt is like a chicken if you spend the whole poem talking about chickens and never once mention your aunt. "Oh, but I really meant it as a metaphor for my aunt." Well, that's great, but you gave the reader absolutely no way to know that, so you're going to have to deal with a lot of enthusiasm for chickens and a lot of confusion about everything else. Metaphors exist to clarify, not obscure. The idea is that by comparing one thing to another thing, you highlight the similarities in ways that bring new insights. This is why Shakespeare begins by asking, "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day?" We get both halves of the metaphor from the start, and that enables us to understand the comparison and how the splendors of the person addressed exceed even the beauties of a summer day. Imagine if all we got was a description of summer flora, and then Shakespeare went around grousing about how nobody understood that it was really a poem about a lover. Buddy, nobody could have known that because you didn't tell us. Half a metaphor is full confusion, and figurative language, though not always straightforwardly clear, isn't coded language. But anyway, this visiting poet then talked about the other tool that we sometimes mistake for metaphor: symbols. By his definition, a metaphor is an equation, A equals B, but a symbol is more like an open question, A equals whatever you want. So, as he put it, when we were asking what the strange imagery in his poems meant, what he intended for them to mean, he said we were misunderstanding them as metaphors. He didn't mean for them to mean any one specific thing. By this definition, when Hemingway says that there is no symbolism in The Old Man and the Sea, what he's probably really saying is that there is no metaphor. The sea is the sea, not half of an equation where the sea is a stand-in for something else. But if the sea is evocative enough to resonate in a meaningful way with a reader's understanding of something else, like, say, the eternal feminine, then that's a symbolic resonance. Hemingway didn't intend to communicate that. He did not set up the equation sea equals woman, but he wrote a text that gave readers room to understand his depiction of the sea as feminine. The Spanish philosopher José Ortega y Gasset argued that everything we say is to some extent unavoidably out of our control. As he put it, every utterance is deficient. It says less than it wishes to say. And every utterance is exuberant. It says more than it plans. So it's a fundamental fact that we aren't fully in control of language. All the time, people are reading more and less into what we say than what we mean, and we shouldn't expect literature to be immune from that. Anything an author writes is going to say less than it wishes to say and more than it plans. And this is, I think, the principle at work in that more specific definition of a symbol. A symbol is something that resonates, that creates room and invites readings beyond the author's intent. So when we were in class asking that poet what all those weird images in his poems meant, he could honestly say he didn't know. Because they weren't metaphors, they weren't secret codes hidden behind obscure language, they were symbols. They were unapologetic exuberances. He didn't mean for them to mean anything specific, but he was perfectly comfortable with readers finding their own meaning in them. And when my friend read my poem about cleaning a church and understood it to be an examination of the sanctifying power of labor, they were talking about something that I didn't intend, but they weren't wrong either. Because every utterance is deficient and every utterance is exuberant, it is an unavoidable reality that readers are going to understand writing in ways that authors never intended. And that's perfectly okay. But there's more to it than just that. Number one, Academic criticism takes the possibility of exuberance and makes an entire methodology out of it. Almost certainly, Hemingway did not mean to make The Old Man and the Sea a fictional examination of the Nietzschean tragic vision. But the scholar who wrote that piece wasn't just making up ridiculous nonsense to sound smart. They were finding a source of meaning in the text that, whether the author intended it or not, is there. It reminds me of a discussion I had when I was being trained to teach rhetorical analysis as a graduate student. The director of the composition program mentioned that when we analyze advertisements with students, for example, there will almost always be one student who says, "This is ridiculous. There's no way the company meant to put that in their ad. It's just an ad. It's not that deep." On some level, the student is right. It's totally possible that the advertiser didn't mean to put a particular message in their ad. But the point of rhetorical analysis is not necessarily to create a description of what the creator intended. It's to account for any of the number of ways a reader might understand the message. Sure, you might think you're just advertising a soft drink, but if your whole audience reads your ad as glossing over urgent socio-political tensions and then boycotts your brand as a result, well, then your intent doesn't matter too much, does it? And it's worth spending some time to think critically about where audiences found that message that you didn't mean to express. Sometimes I think we get the idea that our English teacher, who is doing a good and normal thing in proposing one possible understanding of a text, is actually proposing the one correct way to interpret that text. And then when we suspect that the author couldn't have intended that meaning, we start to distrust our teacher. To use the much memed upon Venn diagram as a point of departure, perfect overlap isn't interesting. What's the point of doing scholarly criticism of a text if all it does is reproduce exactly what the text already tells us? There's just no value in a paper that tells us that in The Old Man and the Sea, the old man is an old man and the sea is a sea. We already know that. A scholarly reading that doesn't overlap with the text at all is also a huge problem. You can't just make up random stuff and say that's what the text is about. In the video introducing poetry that I made a few years ago, we talk about William Carlos Williams' Red Wheelbarrow poem. In the Hemingwayan sense, it's a poem about a red wheelbarrow that is beside white chickens. The wheelbarrow is a wheelbarrow, and the chickens are chickens. But I've gotten a handful of comments over the years that try to turn the poem into an ode to the American agricultural industrial complex. Why? Well, because the wheelbarrow is red, the chickens are white, and the glaze of rainwater, as we all know is universally true of water, is blue. Red and white and blue means the US of A, so when Williams says that so much depends on the red wheelbarrow, he's really saying hip hip hooray for the stars and stripes and proprietary soybeans. Except I'm almost certain that he isn't. Because sure, we've got the agriculture and there is red and white, but saying that the transparent glaze of rainwater on a red wheelbarrow is blue is such a stretch. That sounds a little bit more like someone deciding that it's about American agriculture and then trying to make a case for it, rather than reading it and thoughtfully letting the poem teach it what it has to say. The water in that poem just isn't blue. There's no reason to believe it is, and if Williams really wanted the poem to be red, white, and blue, he's shown himself to be fully capable of crafting simple, specific, and straightforward images that he could have just put some blue jeans in the picture for some added color and rural Americana. But he didn't. So we don't want a reading to just reproduce what a text already tells us, and we can't just make up whatever we want either. Instead, we really do want partial overlap. So you're not owning your English teacher by creating a meme that shows they're reading only partially overlapping with the author's intent. All you've really done is reproduce their basic job description in visual form. Hemingway did not mean to make the sea a symbol of femininity and womanhood. To him, the sea is just the sea. But that doesn't stop a scholar from pointing out all the ways that Hemingway describes the sea with language that evokes femininity and womanhood, and then making an argument about how, based on a reading of the novella, readers might come away with a particular understanding of womanhood. Did Hemingway intend for that to happen? No, we can be really confident that he didn't. But did Hemingway write his book in such a way that he left room for readers to understand the book in that way? He absolutely did, and we should be allowed to talk about it and decide how we feel about the vision of womanhood that the text makes available, whether it's intended or not. Or, for one last, even more dramatic example, take Sonia Foss's textbook Rhetorical Criticism. Not only is it a standard textbook in the field that explains the basics of producing these kinds of articles about texts, but it also outlines 10 different critical methodologies, 10 different ways to read and interpret texts. And, as a special bonus for us, Foss includes essays that one of her students wrote, applying each of the different methodologies to an analysis of the speech that the President of the People's Republic of China gave in 1997 at the United Kingdom's handover of Hong Kong. So, just for a second, it's possible, if we're doing a neo-Aristotelian critique of Jiang's speech, that at some point he did spend some time thinking about ethos, logos, and pathos. But it would be truly surprising if he were thinking seriously about Burkean theory and scene-act ratios. That said, it's both possible and useful to do a pentatic critique of the speech. An author doesn't have to intend something for it to still be worth talking about. And as Foss points out, the goal of rhetorical criticism includes first, contributing to theory, not uncovering the author's original intent, but expanding our understanding of how rhetoric works. As Foss explains, even the study of one artifact allows you to step back from the details of a particular artifact and take a broader view of it and to draw some conclusions about what it suggests concerning some process of rhetoric. She then goes on to say, knowing how rhetoric operates also can help make us more sophisticated audience members for messages. As a result, we become more engaged and active participants in shaping the nature of the worlds in which we live. In other words, it probably isn't that deep. In the author's mind, the curtains probably are just blue curtains. Your teacher is not living under the delusion that the author had some deep, true meaning encoded in the exact shade of blue and the fabric of those curtains. Instead, your teacher is trying to help you to become deeper by pushing you to be a more thoughtful reader. Not just someone who accepts whatever someone tells you, but who considers even unintended messages and how they might shape the way you see the world. It probably isn't that deep, but you can be.
So it isn't, then it is, then it isn't, then maybe it is and isn't. This is going to be one of those where someone comments that it took you too long to get to the point, bud.
I know, they like doing that, but the journey is part of the point. If I wanted to just give you the executive summary and move on, we'd be watching this on TikTok. Instead, because this does seem to be so much in the discourse, I wanted to provide a more thorough explanation with several examples. This isn't just another hot take. It's always surprising to me how people just comment whatever they want. Inevitably, someone will tell me I'm wrong, completely ignoring all the sources and examples I've cited here, but what can you do?
I can think of a lot of things, mostly involving acids and other caustic solutions.
Whoa, that's not what I was talking about.
Fair enough. Maybe later. You know where to find me.
Well, we have covered a lot, and I hope it's given you a better understanding of what's going on in this kind of silly discourse about what is and isn't that deep. Before we quit, though, I want to talk in more practical terms about what all this means for you. Number one, dear writers. You are allowed to write fun stories. You are allowed to write sweet little poems about hummingbirds and daffodils and poplars. You're allowed to write essays about plankton without making them also coded treatises on power dynamics and cross-gender office relationships. I see so many new writers get totally stuck because they can't figure out how to make their work mean something that they end up just not writing anything at all. Your first job is to write something that communicates experiences clearly and engages your readers' emotions. Don't worry about the big ideas, just worry about the story. You don't have to make the ocean stand for something. Trust me, your readers are going to draw all kinds of conclusions about your work that you never intended. They can make you look brilliant way more effectively than you can make you look brilliant. And if you don't want to take my word for it, take it from former U.S. Poet Laureate Ted Kooser. I can't speak for all the poets writing today, but I suspect that the freshest and most engaging poems most often don't come from ideas at all. Ideas are orderly, rational, and to some degree logical. They come clothed in complete sentences like overpopulation is the cause of all the problems in the world. The poet's ideas, his or her reasoned assessments of the world, emerge through the poetry, whether intended or not. But what about so-and-so? They wrote theoretically dense, idea-laden poems. Whoa there, friend. I know you already know because you have a highly developed sense of media literacy, but this video isn't meant for late-career academic poets. It's meant for those of us who are closer to starting out. Again, Kooser has some wisdom for us. Beginning poets sometimes start off trying to stand on the shoulders of famous poets, imitating the difficult and obscure poems these successful poets have published. That's understandable, but they soon learn that somehow no literary journal is interested in publishing their difficult poems. If these beginners were to study the careers of the famous poets upon whose work they're modeling their own, they'd find that those writers were often in their early years publishing clear, understandable poems. I'm not saying you can't write complex poems. I'm saying that there's lots of precedent for writing clear, straightforward poems that do more to bring readers a pleasant refreshing of the world than to activate their deepest scholarly impulses. If you really must write for academic critics, I won't stop you. But don't be surprised when you end up with a very small readership. Now, for those of us who are readers or consumers of media more generally, we have full permission to interpret works. We are not bound by what an author did or did not intend to say. If it's observable in the piece and it's worth talking about, we should talk about it, because that kind of critical literacy makes us more thoughtful people, more discerning consumers, and eventually more effective communicators ourselves. If you find something meaningful in a story or a poem or a video, you're allowed to talk about why you find it meaningful. In fact, I hope you will, because it's good mental exercise. It doesn't matter whether the work in question really is that deep or not, because you are that deep. You're allowed to think about how a work resonates with your human depth, whether the author meant it or not. But a couple of cautions too. Number one, you do not need to make every reading experience into a term paper. Deep critical engagement is useful and important, but you're also allowed to just sit down with a poetry collection, read through it in an evening and say, wow, those poems were nice, and then go to bed. If you read something and you're satisfied with the old man being an old man and the sea being the sea, great. Far more people read and enjoy Hemingway than publish peer-reviewed criticism of Hemingway, and that's fine. Number two, if you do enjoy a little academic criticism, that's awesome for you. But it does not make you a smarter or better person than people who don't. Different people have different priorities. Nothing makes me want to run from a room faster than being told I have to do critical analysis of Shakespeare. You couldn't pay me to do it. Well, maybe you could, but it would have to be a lot. But I regularly do rhetorical criticism all the time for free. Somebody who chooses not to engage deeply with classic literature could very well be engaging deeply with something else, and that doesn't make them illiterate. But it does make you a little bit of an ego case if you think it does. Now, we love our cyclical literacy crises. We all lost our minds about how far behind school kids were after Sputnik launched. In the 70s, we were all worked up about how Johnny couldn't write, and now we're seeing people lament the death of critical thinking and media literacy. Now, I've only been in the classroom for a little over a decade, but the students of today are not really different from the students I taught in the beginning in any significant way. So whatever high-profile stories there are about college students being illiterate now, I'd say a lot of that worry is kind of unwarranted. But anyway, caution number three. Your right and privilege to find meaning in a text that an author did not intend is not licensed to say that a text means anything you want it to mean. I've had readers really take their understanding of my work light years away from anything I was actually talking about. And I remember once hearing a student in class provide a lovely argument for the heartwarming vision of home and family depicted by the birdhouse in a poem we had just read in class, except that there was no birdhouse in the poem. There were birds, and there was a human house, but they had just clearly misread the text. Every text is exuberant, but that doesn't mean that every text can mean whatever you want. That is, you're allowed to find meaning in a text that the author didn't intend, but you aren't really allowed to misread a text. There's a difference between saying that Hemingway's depiction of the sea resonates with your experience of womanhood and saying that what Hemingway writes about the sea is a coded message of unrequited love to a specific person. The first is reasonable critical interpretation of a text, and the second is make-believe. Utterances are exuberant, but there's also a reasonable margin of error, and going beyond the fundamental evidence of the text is willful misunderstanding, not genius. And I guess as a bonus, always approach criticism with a good amount of humility and self-awareness. It's always a little amusing that the comments that most obviously misunderstand my videos come from the people who most evidently see themselves as mega-intelligent critical thinkers. You're not really doing critical thinking, though, when you pitch a fit about what you think someone said instead of what they actually said. Stay close to the textual evidence and be cautious about jumping to conclusions. But anyway, I'm sure there's so much more we could say and probably 100 things I meant to say but left out. So it's a good thing this isn't the last video I'll ever make. I'll just finish by reaffirming the point I made before. Everything I've learned about writers and writing makes it clear that it usually isn't that deep. Most writers, most of the time, just aren't in the business of encoding secret messages into their work. It's hard enough to tell a good story. There's no reason to make that good story a code for something else too. But you, dear viewer, are deep. And because you are deep, you can perceive unintended depth in the media you consume. Creative reading is just as real and just as valuable as creative writing, and critical consumption of media is an important way to improve yourself and the world. Just because the author didn't intend for something to be deep in a particular way, that doesn't mean that you can't find it deeply meaningful. And we'll all be better off if you take the time to share why. So yeah, the curtains are almost certainly just blue. But if that means something to you, well, that's the wonderful thing about art. Now, we've been at this entirely too long, so go do some critical thinking, or not. Doing it all the time can be exhausting. Either way, have a great week, and we'll see you again in the next one.